Hello guys, I'm Super Ron, welcome back to the G Unit and welcome to episode 26 of my GBS0 build. We're back over here at the sticker wall, which kind of turned into the engine building area, even though we haven't done any engine building yet. But we're back on the cylinder head this week because remember when this guy said this. But we are all good. I think we can now declare the cylinder head completely finished. He was mistaken, so let's find out why. So let's rewind back to the episode where we worked on this head. This is actually the COSCAST cylinder head off my red Astra in the corner. I ran it on there in the turbo version for many years, and it's got a lot of modifications before I even started. It's got oversized exhaust valves, it's got massively ported and polished inlet and exhaust ports, it's had lots of milling and work done, all polished up in the combustion chambers. And when I disassembled it, I discovered that it had CAMS upgraded single valve springs. So I gave it all a refresh up, I lapped in the valves, I fitted new stem seals and reassembled it all back together. But when I was assembling, there's something I wasn't quite happy with. The way the springs went in, they weren't quite locating in the top hats. There was movement left and right. So I disassembled a standard cylinder head and tried the valve springs on the top hats, and they were really snug and centralized in there. But when I put those same retainers onto the CAMS springs, which had got a bigger diameter spring, there was movement in there and I wasn't quite happy with it. So I tried doing a little bit of research to find out what I actually had, what the springs were. So on them they had CAMS 2004, but all the research and Googling I did, I could not find a part number that matched up with that. So I sent a little email to CAMS themselves, and a guy called Andy got back to me and he said these are actually pre-production springs. So that 2004 is actually the date they were manufactured before they got part numbers. So he said this could possibly be a 16, 17-year-old spring. But I said it wasn't too much of a problem because, like I said, it's off the Astra and this has been sitting on my shelf for about 12 years. So I had it for a few years before that, so that would line up that about right. These were bought way back in 2004 and used for a few years and then stuck back on my shelf. So when they went into production, the part number that these had was VS45, which then gave me the spec of the spring and I could see what they needed. So Andy did say that these springs shouldn't be run with standard top retainers. They should have the CAMS upgraded ones, which is why we've got this movement in the top, which does make sense. So once we found out what the springs were, we could look at the poundage and what they were rated to, whether they'd be okay for my SBD cams. So we went through and he looked at the acceleration rate and the deceleration rate and the lift and the duration of the spec of my SBD cams, and he said we are going to be right on the borderline with these springs, because if the springs aren't stiff enough as the cam rotates and the lobe goes round and the valves don't come up quick enough, the next time round we're going to get valves float, we're going to get valve bounce, and that is not good news, because if they're bouncing, the valve drops, hit the piston, and then we are game over, and we do not want that to happen. So he looked through the spec of the cams and he said we are going to be right on the borderline. So Andy said speak to SBD, because the cams that I've got, there's no identical profile on the CAMS catalogue, so we couldn't get an exact comparison to say whether they definitely would be okay. So I spoke to SBD and straight away they came back and said, no, these springs are not going to be up to the job of supporting these cams. They do use these valve springs and they are still in production, but only for their lower profile cams. Because you saw how big they were, I had to grind out all parts of the heads just so they could go round. The lobes were that big on them. And they said straight away, you need double valve springs for this setup. So that left me with some options. I've already got the single valve springs, which are upgraded over standard, but I would need to buy the CAMS retainers, which are about 150 quid. And on top of that, then I'd need to buy some new cams with a less aggressive profile for all this to work together. So we could be up to £300, £400, £500 with the new cams, with the new top retainers, and getting less power than we originally thought. Now the other option is I have got a full set of standard cams here, so I could put standard cams in, standard valve springs, standard retainers, and I've got all that here and that would be free, but would be very limited on our power then. We'd only be probably not much over standard. We'd be able to rev a little bit higher, but with the high compression pistons, the throttle bodies, the big bore exhaust, we just wouldn't be making the good use of it with these cams. So the other option is to go down the double valve spring route. So I'd need double valve springs, new bottom seats, new top retainers and new valve stem steels. But we would be able to run these big cams, and that would make this setup absolutely bulletproof. We'd not have to worry about anything in the future. But again, this could be £400 or £500 worth of stuff for the double valve springs. So I've got the option of, for free, I could go back to standard and only run, I don't know, 160, 170 horsepower. Or I could spend £400 or £500, get some less aggressive cams, use these valve springs with new retainers and be up to maybe 200 horsepower. Or spend £400 or £500 on a full double valve spring setup on the valve train, keep the head as it is and use the huge SBD cams and probably chase for 220, 230 horsepower. So those are my options, and it's pretty obvious which one I'm going to choose. We want as much power as possible and we want it reliable. So I spoke to Andy again at Kent CAMS, and the next day we got a nice package through. So Andy was on it with the delivery and they arrived straight away the next day. When I first started the channel and started on the sticker wall, I emailed lots of companies and asked for stickers and bits and pieces. And Kent CAMS said no problem, they sent me quite a few through, so I've got these ones here, I've got them all around the sticker wall, so super thank you for that. So we didn't need any more stickers, but now we've got top merch, we've got a new cup, and a Kent CAMS keyring, and of course the bits we needed, we've got the double valve springs. So we've got the new top retainers, so these are actually the same ones that we would have needed for the single valve springs, and these are the same for the double valve springs. So these are the seats that we needed for the double valve springs, and then the springs themselves. So as you can see, one sits inside the other, so they are extra stiff, so we have no trouble with valve bounce or valve float, and that won't cause us any trouble. So hopefully we've got 16 in here, and let's get them together. So these are a lot of money, but that's just, in the motorsport world, these things are needed. But it is quite refreshing, even though they were a lot of money, you do get a lot of pieces, so it makes it a bit more bearable, because price per piece isn't so bad. So like we did before, we're going to tape up the top and bottom surfaces, so when we're putting the tool in and out, we don't have to worry about what's on the other side, because you don't want to nick this. This is now a machine surface. I've head-to-head skimmed, so any dent or nick will upset the head gasket, and that's not what we want. So I'll tape this up and then we don't have to worry. So that's the skimmed face, now all safe and protected. So when we're putting the tool in and out, taking the valves, if it does just touch the surface, we don't have to worry too much. It's not going to nick into it, and we can concentrate on the job at hand, which is compressing the springs and getting the collets out. Now, I didn't film the disassembly last time, only the reassembly, but it is so much easier because you just put the tool in, compress the spring, get a little magnet and suck the collets out. So let's get a valve out. I had to modify this Clark valve tool to fit the 16 valve head, because this bit should be up here and it wasn't deep enough to fit inside the head. So I welded a little extension on and this works really well now. So all you do is put this end on the valve and carefully put this end down on the top retainer. Give it all a squeeze and then just put your magnet in and fish out the collet. Like that. And then the valve spring should come out. So we've got the top retainer, which we know is just a standard GM item, not suitable for these springs, and our pre-production Kent CAMS 2004. So I've took the valve out. Here's the setup where it is. This top retainer goes on there, and as you can see, we had this movement which I wasn't happy about. So with these new retainers, that should be snug, which is exactly how it should be. So all the time I was running these on the Astra like this. Lucky nothing went wrong, but they survived. So these are the collets that hold the valve in. They've got these little grooves in, and they fit in these little grooves on the valve like that. 1, 2, and as you can see, there's a taper on there. There's also a taper in here. So when this is released and these disappear in here, the taper forces these to hold together, which takes it in. And the spring is pushing this up to hold these in place. So what happens if this then comes out of there, that releases these, which can drop off, and the valve plonk into your piston. Definitely not what you want. So it's why the poundage of the springs are very important, because the bigger the cams, the more the acceleration and deceleration, the stronger springs you need. And it's also running the standard GM bottom seat, which you see also has all this movement, whereas the new CAMS one, which it should have had, nice and snug. So I was very lucky that nothing ever went wrong on this engine. If you remember from the previous episode when we were rebuilding the head, we found these little orange straws in the bag with the new valve stem seals, and we found out what they're actually for is to go over the end of the valve like that. So when the new seals go over, they don't get cut up by the sharp edges of the valves. So I'd already fitted the valve stem seals before, but as we're going one by one, and I had to take the valve stem seals back off to fit the bottom seats, so we need to replace them anyway. And these are the smaller ones, because these will go over the small springs. I thought we'd give these magic straws a go. So we'll put a bit of oil on the valve again, just to make sure it's all lubed up in the valve guide. Put him in its hole. So now we need a new bottom seat. Drop that in. And then we put our little magic straw on. And put one of these new valve stem seals on. So give that a little oil in there. Push it over the top. Then we need our 11mm socket, which we found sat perfectly over the spring, and we're able to push it in with that. And we are on. No drama, llama. Just give that a little tap to make sure it's seated home. Very nice. And now we get to put our super duper double valve springs in. Valve springs on. I can already feel the spring on them is huge. And we've got our double step for the outer spring and the inner spring. See if we can compress these bad boys. Whew. Well, with my scientific torque wrench arm, I can already feel they are way stiffer. And let's see if I can be as successful this time as I was last time, getting these collets in. So I just put a little dab of grease on the inside to hold them, a little dab on the outside to hold it to my screwdriver. And then just locate it in those grooves. 1. 2. So they're located in the grooves, and when the retainer comes up, that's going to clamp them in. So now, let's try and carefully take this out. Job done, valve spring number 1. So I'm just going to do these one by one. I'm not going to take them all out and then put them all back together, because then I don't have to worry about them getting all mixed up. But that looks a lot more manly in there. So these are the ones with the standard GM caps, and you can see what I was worried about. You can just see a bit of the valve spring there at the edge sticking out because they're not centralised. But on this new one, you can see they're much more manly. It's all located. So 15 more to go. And job complete. These top retainers are so much more chunkier than the standard GM ones. I was really struggling to get the collets in there to start with, and because the springs are so much stronger, I couldn't get enough force to clamp them in. So what I had to do is clamp them in and then just put a few more turns on here to get the clearance over the big retainer at the top. And then once I discovered that, I was just nipping them in just like last time. So for the inlet ones, the second time round, that was really quick. Just whipped them all down. All the collets went in first time. The classic little dab of grease worked a treat. So I think I really can say now, the cylinder head is complete. I'm really happy. This has future-proofed it as well, because we've got these huge great cams. They are still hydraulic profile, so it's the hydraulic lifters that are going to limit our RPM now. But in the future, if we wanted to go absolutely crazy and go up to mechanical lifters, then these valve springs will still handle that nicely, and the sky is the limit. So for now, this is going to make an absolute bulletproof setup. We've got these nice big cams, we've got the double valve springs, we've got all the correct seats and retainers now, so we have got a superb setup on the top here. So again, a huge thank you to Andy at Kent Cams. He was really helpful. He went through all the details, all the specifications, and got me exactly what I needed. So now we've got the full competition setup in this cylinder head. So I'm going to wrap this episode up here. We are job complete. I just want to say a huge thank you to all the support I got last week with the problem, what we had with the cracked block. On the internet, it can go one of two ways. You can just sometimes get loads of abuse, like, why didn't you check that? Why didn't you spot that? Or you can get all the support coming in. So that just goes to show that we've built up a really good community now. We've got really people that are interested in the build and want to see it succeed. So that has driven me to get on with it. Now I've got all this complete. We can crack on with the bottom end. I'm going to give this block a go, getting the stud out myself and see how we go, and then get all the machine work done in this new block. So then we will be all set to rebuild the engine up. We've got the cylinder head all ready. So this week we are ending on a much happier episode. So until next time, CJ, make sure you have fun.